these days, so I work for in Vodafone's group fraud team. So that's basically working across all of Vodafone's local markets around the globe, trying to identify and share fraud intelligence, best practice. I'm responsible for training and a few other areas. So it's a great role in that I get to hear about all of the the many different types of fraud that impact our markets around the world. So I have a sort of pretty steady supply of really interesting fraud reports, fraud intelligence. And this topic that I'm going to talk about today is something that's really just over the last bit more than a year now has just really come towards the top of the pile in terms of being a fraud threat that we're worried about. So let me just share my screen so I can commence the presentation. Okay. Okay, Sarah, is that displaying correctly?
Yep, all good. Thanks.
Okay, great. I shall begin. Okay, so the real focus of what I want to talk about today is vendor email compromise, but I think you sort of have to begin with business email compromise, which is sort of what, that's a much more familiar topic. That's something that we've been talking about and been aware of for quite a long time now, for several years. So I do just want to give that as the backdrop. Again, there may be some people on the call who aren't so aware of that type of fraud. So I think we have to sort of lay that foundation before we move on to talk about vendor email compromise. So business email compromise, I mean, it traditionally comes in via email, but we have certainly seen it branch out into other other mediums such as WhatsApp in recent times. But it targets particular teams within a company, and it uses social engineering and impersonation of senior executives, or impersonation sometimes of vendors and suppliers. And it's basically trying to drive those targeted individuals into, in most cases, paying out some money, but it can be disclosing sensitive information or even customer data in some cases. Now, it's been an issue for a long time. It started with a couple of specific organized crime groups. There was certainly one of those groups based in France who have even gone on to be the subject of a film, which I can recommend to you after this call if you're interested. But it started out very much with one or two organized crime groups, and then it's moved on to become another of the sort of mass market fraud. So there's a very large community of fraudsters who are aware of this methodology. They're aware that it can yield, high financial returns with a relatively low investment required, because you have to take some time to do the research. But in terms of the tools of the trade as a fraudster in this case, you really only need a couple of laptops. You're basically just sending and responding to emails. So it has gone out into the sort of wider fraud market, but there are still, and this is particularly relevant in terms of what I will come on to talk about, there are still some very serious organized crime groups behind this fraud. And some of the reports that I've read explain the sort of corporate hierarchy almost of those crime groups. And they split into three roles. So you've got the sort of effectively the CEO, who's leading it, who's sort of orchestrating the attacks, and is probably ultimately the main financial beneficiary of what's happening. But then you've got more junior roles within these teams as well. So you've got the researchers, and these are effectively the back office who are going out into, well, I mean, LinkedIn is an obvious example, but they're just going out into the public domain, and then also perhaps harvesting a little bit from the dark net as well, and they're just building up the information that's needed to make the attacks credible. And then you have the sort of the front of house, who are sending the emails, and then when they get a bite, working on that target, so sending the emails back and forth, and eventually trying to lead them towards to making the payment or whatever it is that they're trying to get them to do. So that's that's just a bit of background on business email compromise. And as I said, probably the most important element of that, linking into what I'll be talking about with vendor email compromise, is the serious organized criminal groups behind this. So there are various types of business email compromise, and it's one of these on the screen that I'll be particularly talking about today. I mean, the most common one perhaps is and the most talked about anyway over the last few years has been the CEO fraud. So that's where the email comes in and impersonates a senior member of a senior officer within your company, basically taking advantage of the fact that people will, when they see an email come in from someone very senior to them, they'll typically be very keen to help. They won't ask too many questions because you don't want to be seen to be questioning someone at that level of authority. So that's a really common one, but there are variants of it. So impersonating legal officials, so that's the top right example on this slide here, and then bogus invoice. So that is more the supplier impersonation. Now, the bogus invoice case is one that it links into the vendor email compromise, but this again is this is an element that makes vendor email compromise so dangerous, is that it's not a bogus invoice, it's a real invoice. And that's something that I'll explain in a couple of slides' time. So, as I said, BEC, initially, we mainly saw it in emails, and not particularly well written or constructed emails. But we've seen over the last couple of years, we've seen it move on very quickly. We had a lot of BEC fraud coming in through WhatsApp. So they were creating WhatsApp accounts with using images of our ExCo members, and then sending WhatsApp messages to people in our finance teams, in legal teams, again, trying to drive them towards an action in terms of making a payment. And I think we definitely have to also talk about the impact now of deep fakes in this area of risk. So the voice deep fake, if you think about a lot of the senior people in your company, there's probably something somewhere on YouTube or elsewhere on the internet, some videos of them speaking, and that is the sample that you need to create a voice deepfake. And it may sound, like a risk that's still round the corner, but it's not. It's arrived because there was a report fairly recently from Deutsche Telekom through the GSMA. This was telling us that they had already had such an attack, where again, a sort of ExCo level employee was impersonated in that way with a voice deepfake. So it just gives them another channel of attack, and it gives them some real sort of credibility as well in terms of the attack. And that Deutsche Telekom case, they were actually they got quite far with it. I think they tricked the first person in the first conversation, and it was only sort of a little bit down the line that somebody realized that it wasn't quite right. Just the last point I'd mention on this slide is the point here about skillfully crafted emails. So a lot of the BEC frauds that we were seeing a couple of years ago, the emails were pretty badly written, and they were just like, they would sort of come out of the blue. So there'd be no email chain. It would just be one or two lines, often with some grammatical errors, no context. What we've again seen in the last year or so is some of those emails coming in with a very skillfully crafted email chain behind it, including sort of emails from other people in Vodafone. I mean, not actual emails, but they've basically just crafted these emails to look like somebody quite senior had approved the transaction. So again, that's another example of how they'll just sort of constantly improve what they're doing to increase their chances of success. So with BEC, you know, we've been aware of it for a long time, as I'm sure all of you have. We got out there and did some awareness and training activities around it, and you know, we gave them the checklist of things to look out for in terms of the emails that come in. So you know, look for the tone of the email, spelling and grammar mistakes. We gave them some pointers in terms of the sort of typical content of a BEC email. For example, the fact that it's always like very urgent, so that you know, there's always this kind of out of the blue urgency to those emails. So we gave the relevant colleagues around Vodafone a bit of training on it. We gave them those pointers to look out for. We've also done a bit on the technical side in terms of some of the solutions that exist in this space. So we've been doing some like phishing campaigns where we actually sort of send phishing emails to colleagues, and we just sort of monitor the click rate, and it gives us a sense of how many people are in Vodafone and maybe susceptible to this type of fraud. So you know, we felt pretty comfortable at that point in time with what we had done, but I would say the incident that we first had last year in terms of vendor email compromise completely changed everything, and I think maybe highlighted that we had got a little bit into a maybe even a little bit of a comfort zone on this topic, and that's the bit that I really wanted to get to today, and just make sure that everybody on this call was really clear on exactly what this VEC threat looks like and what you can do about it. So that's a lot of background, and probably pretty familiar to most of you on the call. What hopefully I'll do now is you know, tell you a couple of things that you didn't know, or at least maybe your organization hasn't been exposed to yet. So vendor email compromise, it's different to BEC. It comes from a realization that some of the target companies, I mean, you know, I have to talk for Vodafone here, had done a pretty good job of putting in the necessary processes and controls and filters and firewalls to put up a pretty good defense against it, you know, that type of fraud. So they moved one link in the chain away and started to target us and other major organizations through our suppliers. Because if you think about the number of suppliers that Vodafone has, it's a very, very long list, and some of those companies are smaller, newer. They don't have such robust controls. They don't have the history. They haven't learned the lessons in terms of those types of frauds. It's not really what their business is about. You know, if you think about some of the creative companies that we would do business with to help us with marketing and external communications, you know, we don't necessarily hire them for, for their excellent security. Of course, we have a baseline that we expect them to meet, but it's inevitable that somewhere within that supply chain there'll be some points of weakness. So what the fraudsters do is they target those suppliers, and through phishing emails, they look to get into the inboxes, or the Office 365 accounts rather, of people in the finance teams in those supplier organizations. So there'll be, again, it's still all pretty targeted. This, I mean, this isn't a kind of spam type of attack. It's pretty targeted. They'll probably hit a good number of these targets, and once they're in, and once they have that breach of that employee's Office 365 account, that's when the really interesting part of this kicks in. And this is the first point I would really strongly emphasize, is that with the BEC fraud, as soon as they get a bite from the target, then it's an immediate sort of exchange of emails and trying to drive them towards the desired action. With VEC, once they've got into that Office 365 account, they will sit on it for as long as it takes to get all of the information that they need to craft the perfect attack or near perfect attack. So they will monitor that inbox and maybe other elements of the Office 365 account if they're able to, and they will gather all of the information they need in terms of contact names, email chains, invoices, any other documentation, company-headed paper, whatever they need to perfectly execute the attack. They will sit for months if they need to, until they've got exactly what they need, and then they'll finally reach a point where they'll identify, and this will typically be an outstanding invoice. So again, they will wait until there's that type of conversation already happening about an outstanding invoice, and that's when they pounce. So they may try and do it all through that Office 365 account which they've breached, but there's a higher risk of detection with that. So this will often be the point that they switch to a spoofed domain that resembles the suppliers. And on the next slide, I'll give you sort of an example of exactly what that looked like to Vodafone when we were targeted with this type of attack. So they may do it through that 365 account. They may set up a spoof domain that looks like the suppliers and start the correspondence from that side. But when you put all of that together, and also another detail I would mention is that they use Office 365 on their side as well, so the look and feel is right, because again, that was something that with BEC, just the look and feel even of the emails and the tools they were using to send the emails weren't consistent with what we would expect within Vodafone. So you put all of that together, and it's an incredibly dangerous threat for any organization, because the things that we traditionally looked out for with BEC, so many of them aren't there anymore. You will see an email chain that you're very familiar with already, and suddenly the fraudster is in it. You'll see not contracts, invoices that you've been discussing over the last week or two, and again, the fraudster has those. So that's why this is so effective, and I'll go on to now a couple of examples of exactly what this looked like for Vodafone. Last point I would highlight on this slide is the company Agari. I have no association with them, but I would definitely commend them for their some of the papers that they put out around BEC and VEC. I would very strongly recommend that you read the Silent Starling report, which I've linked at the bottom of this slide. It's freely available and is really incredibly insightful in terms of this type of fraud and its origins as well. So yeah, I mean, just to rewind a little bit. So about a bit over a year ago, Vodafone had a couple of incidents. One was in our one of our shared service centres, and one was impacting Vodafone Ireland, and we saw pretty much what I just described. So the fraudster was impersonating a Vodafone supplier. They were requesting a change of bank account and payment of outstanding invoices. And in these cases, they had access to these genuine email trails, and they had the real documentation. So we looked at those and we just thought, well, it looks like some kind of BEC, but maybe it's an internal fraud. And we weren't totally clear on what we were seeing. And that's because at that point we weren't so familiar with this vendor email compromise type of attack, and we actually wasted some time as a result of that, trying to understand if it was an internal fraud, because that was an obvious conclusion to us, that if they've got all those emails, all those documents, it's either an internal fraud in Vodafone or an internal fraud at the supplier. And what we now know is that it was neither. Thankfully, a good number of months ago now, we became very clear on the vendor email compromise methodology, and we were able to sort of start responding to that in a more focused way. And just during the summer, the summer that's just gone, we've seen further cases impacting our markets in Italy and also in the Netherlands. So it's a global issue for us. That much is very clear. And I've just got a couple of case studies now. I mean, this is what the one that impacted us in the Netherlands looks like. And to be honest, this doesn't add that much to what I described earlier. This is what a typical VEC case looks like. It was a vendor employee had their Office 365 account hacked, and again they just waited for that right moment with an outstanding invoice for 620,000 euros. In that case, in this particular case, they chose to create the spoof domain, so it was the correct company name, but they used they had the extension .biz, and thankfully in this case there was a sufficiently alert colleague spotted that email extension and notified the corporate security team. Typical of a lot of these cases, where a lot of this does originate out of West Africa, so we saw a lot of IP addresses in Nigeria. The bank the money would have been destined for was in Lithuania, and again it's very common to see the sort of activity originating in that part of the world, but then the money actually landing somewhere within Europe. External to Vodafone, I think just to drive home the potential scale of this type of fraud. This again is, I would really recommend reading the report that I've linked at the bottom of this slide. It's a classic VEC case, and it was near enough $10 million that went out of a NOR fund, and it was very, very well executed. It had a little bit of a COVID-19 element as well. It sort of they struck in the early days of COVID-19 in terms of the lockdown and companies adjusting. There was a lot of disruption to businesses at that time, and that was pretty pretty well exploited by these fraudsters. And yeah, I just think it's you know, again, Vodafone, like any company in our industry, we pay out some pretty big invoices. So you know, that there's no reason to sort of think that this, you know, this will just be you know, a few $1,000s out the door. You know, in a case like this one, it's $10 million. And I think the report is absolutely worth the read, and it'll probably ring true for one or two organizations in terms of a bit of a lack of worst case thinking, is the way it was put in the report. You know, just not giving this type of risk enough consideration. So again, definitely some bedtime reading that I would recommend to you all. Okay, so who's behind this? As I said at the beginning, there's a lot of serious organized crime, and they're investing heavily in this type of fraud. The returns are enormous, and there've certainly been a number of stories in the media recently about some, you know, thankfully one or two of them getting caught, and the huge sums of money that they're sat on. And if you think about that previous case, $10 million just from one case, you know, it's not surprising. And I've seen some pretty startling numbers being put forward by the FBI, for example, in terms of what BEC and VEC are costing us around the world. So you know, it's just going to get worse. You know, the number of countries, US organized crime, Russian organized crime, West African, it's, you know, that list is not going to shrink. It's such an attractive fraud. It's only going to get worse. They're only going to get better at what they're doing, and they'll be able to invest in better technology, better people, to keep driving this forwards. Okay, so what can you actually do about it? So this is sort of the Vodafone take on it anyway. We had to just try and get the message back out there as quickly as possible. So we've been driving a number of awareness activities, and we've been asking our local markets to basically push that message through to the relevant teams in each country, because that's the best defense against this. And what we wanted to really challenge is the fact that probably a lot of people thought they understood this type of fraud, and they were pretty comfortable that the email would be quite easy to spot. And I think, yeah, as I said earlier, maybe we were in a little bit of a comfort zone on it. We have to absolutely challenge that, because with VEC, it's just infinitely harder to spot, to spot that it's a fraud. The number of clues, they're so few in these cases. Also, in parallel to that, you definitely have to double down on the processes. So, any process that touches on changing bank details, updating vendor files, initiating any form of payment, you need to make very sure that those processes are correct and operate correctly. And I think probably the point I would stress here is, often those processes sound great on the face of it when you ask the relevant team to tell you about it, but there's some kind of manual workaround. There's like there's some sort of process that exists for emergencies, and it's that kind of side process, manual workaround that will be exploited in a case like this. So again, don't just check the core process, make very sure that there isn't some kind of tangential process to that which could be exploited. And I guess just the last point I've put on this slide is, maybe for some people on the call, you might be the the vendor, the supplier organization that's targeted in this case. So rather than being the end target, as Vodafone has been with some of these attacks recently, you may be the conduit. And again, does everybody in your organization know about this type of attack? Do they know perhaps what to look out for to avoid being the victim, sorry, the sort of the jumping off point for the fraudsters. You don't want to be the Office 365 account that gets breached that then allows the subsequent fraud to happen. So again, you might want to get that kind of message to your colleagues. Okay, and just some sort of, how am I doing on time here? Just a couple of final thoughts in terms of what else you can do. I think there are some really important teams around the business to speak to. So on the legal contractual side, let's make sure that we are as protected as best we can be should we have this kind of case. So in terms of liability, in terms of the right to investigate what's happened. And I would have to say that in one of the earlier cases that we had, the supplier was not at all cooperative in helping us investigate what had happened. And now I understand the VEC fraud so well, I can kind of see why, because they were probably pretty embarrassed about what had happened. But again, having the sort of contractual right to investigate and audit in response to this type of incident can be very helpful. I think you need to work with your cyber colleagues on this topic, and they may well actually be the first to hear about some of these attacks. They definitely sit a little bit between the fraud and the cyber world, so you need to work together constantly on this topic. You need your awareness and comms teams to help you get the message out to the right people as effectively as possible. And then lastly, and probably not so obviously, insurance. Now, this story that I've linked at the bottom of the slide is a really interesting point of reference, because this was where an insurer refused to pay against a $6.9 million loss arising from a BEC fraud. So I think you could typically expect to have some level of insurance cover for these scenarios. But you need to make sure that first of all you do, and that there aren't any exceptions and circumstances where a claim could be refused. So again, I would say look at that story that I've linked at the bottom of the slide and take that to your colleagues who deal with insurance and say, look, can we make very sure that we've got some kind of fallback position here? Should we be a victim? Okay, so that was the main content really I just wanted to get across today. And I think the key points are this is big business. It's only going to get bigger. They're only going to get better at it. And you have to try and keep up with it as best you can, because as with vendor email compromise, we were simply not aware of that methodology being used by the fraudsters. So when we had our first attack of it, we wasted a lot of time, trying to understand what had happened. We absolutely can't rely on our traditional BEC defenses. VEC has changed everything in that regard. So we need to get back out there, tell colleagues all about it. And alongside that, let's make damn sure that all the processes are as strong as they need to be, and that there aren't any sneaky little exceptions in there. So that was it really. Yeah, just this is the kind of wealth that these guys are generating, by the way. So if you needed any more incentive, motivation to get out there and make sure your organization is protected, we don't want these guys to get any richer. I think 2 Bentleys is probably enough for anyone. So that was it really. I'll stop sharing now.